Good afternoon. I should say good afternoon to those of you who are in London, who are in Europe. Good morning to those of you, including our panelists, two of whom are in on the East Coast of the United States. It's a real pleasure and honor to be able to welcome all of you and to moderate this discussion with three such remarkable as well as distinguished panelists. I'm Leslie Benjamori. I direct the U.S. and Americas program here at Chatham House. For I think 2 months now, we've been holding a series of roundtables, and each time I think, my God, we are sitting through one of the most extraordinary moments in our history. And I think each week it feels like we have moved into a new moment, or that the contours of that moment have rapidly developed, and that's certainly the case over the last 14 days. The topic of today's panel, where is the global response to COVID-19? I think that those of you who are members of Chatham House, who stay close to us, know the relevance and the great importance of this topic. And people are listening because it's really tremendously important. I have to introduce very briefly, because our participants, our panelists are so distinguished that if I wasn't brief, we'd be here for a long time listening to introductions. But in introducing our first speaker, Lord Mark Malloch-Brown, I also have to thank him because Mark was, of course, very active and proactive in talking with me about the importance of this topic, of this panel, and of these voices on the panel right from the very beginning. Those of you who are familiar with Lord Malloch-Brown's distinguished career won't be surprised, but if you know him personally, you especially won't be surprised that he's just very committed to mentoring and engaging all of us who care very passionately about international affairs. Mark Malloch-Brown was previously the #2 at the United Nations. He was obviously has also served in the British cabinet and in the Foreign Office. He was the administrator of UNDP for 6 years. He was Deputy Secretary General and Chief of Staff to Kofi Annan. He is currently chairman of SGO and its election division, Smartmatic, which is very interesting now because, of course, they're worried very much about the integrity of elections and elections technology through COVID-19. Couldn't be more important for those of us thinking about the US and Americas leading up to November. And so we are very, very glad to have Mark here. He's obviously also chair of many very important boards, not least the UN Foundation. Following Mark, we have Ambassador Elizabeth Cousins, who I have followed as a friend and as a loyal follower of your distinguished career working in the US government and at the United Nations for many years. Elizabeth is currently president and CEO of the UN Foundation. She previously has worked globally in Nepal, in the Middle East. She was ambassador to the UN Economic and Social Council. She played a leading role for the United States in negotiating the SDGs at the UNGA. She's clearly made a very important contribution. And she's recently written a piece in The Guardian, which I tweeted. I'll encourage you to have a look about the topic of this panel. And following Elizabeth, last and obviously not least, Ambassador Nicholas Burns, who joins us from Massachusetts. Ambassador Burns is currently the Roy and Barbara Goodman Family Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's the last person I saw in person at a real-world conference in March. We made it halfway through the conference. Ambassador Burns has worked for 27 years in diplomacy. He is currently also, I should say, on the panel of senior advisors at Chatham House, very important to all of us. He was Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs 2005 to 2008. He was ambassador to NATO, the US ambassador to NATO, ambassador to Greece, and has held many very important posts. So thank you to all three of you. Clearly, there's no need to stress the level of your significance in speaking to these questions. So let me turn, I guess, first to you, Mark. We talked about this. You're clearly very important in terms of the role of the IMF but your work in the UN, you're following the international system from the inside, from the outside. What is your thought? Where is the international response to COVID-19? Is it as grim as we all feel it's been? Or are there some bright spots? And I guess, where would you point us to?
Well, thanks, Leslie, and thanks for those kind words of introduction to all of us. What would a good international response look like? Well, I suppose it would, on the health side, see less of a scramble for global procurement where the rich beat the poor and where the distribution of PPE and other material vital to the first response seems, to have gotten diverted to rich countries at the expense of poor. But going forward, you'd want policies around vaccine development and distribution and other treatments to be really modeled around universal access and affordable access, if not a full public good for all. I think on the economic side, you'd want to see some similarity of fiscal stimulus available to the countries of the global south as is available through largely domestic or regional means, in the case of the EU, to countries of the North. And I think you'd also want to see, common rules and standards around travel policy and movement of goods and people between economies, so that, when you try to restart the global economy, you do it for the whole global economy rather than in fits and starts. Or if you do it in fits and starts, it's around common shared standards of measurement about at what point countries are safe to leave lockdown. And, finally, you would have at the beginning of this wanted full early disclosure of the science of the infection for international researchers and others to get on it as quickly as possible, and for the global response to have been rolled out as quickly as possible. And if that was good or ideal, how do we score against it? Well, obviously it goes without saying, on the health response side, there's been huge unevenness, with some countries horribly handicapped with almost no ventilators, very limited PPE provision, etc. And, actually, in general, the international donor response weak across all of this. On the economic side, it's a mixed picture, because many of us at the beginning hoped that the international financial system would be able to do some sort of mega issuance of new SDRs, a IMF tool, which would, have allowed the same sort of short-term fiscal stimulus across countries all countries that we've had in the North. That hasn't happened, largely because of the objections of the US Treasury Secretary, Stephen Mnuchin, but also because there actually hasn't been a huge, compelling, universal demand from developing countries. But what has happened is the IMF has rolled out something like 66 emergency country packages. The World Bank has been very much on its front foot about the provision of finance. So the management of these institutions have done quite well within the sort of politically rather limited notion of international solidarity and support that governments have given them. I don't need to tell anyone living in Britain that the travel rules are a complete mess, and where you can travel between countries, and the conditions of quarantine when you arrive are a complete sort of look like a bad game board. I mean, there's no rationality to it at all, really. And on the early notification point, I think WHO, it's becoming clearer and clearer that while some of the wilder claims of a disease engineered in a laboratory and released for malicious purpose seems way off the mark, almost certainly this disease was around a lot longer than the Chinese have even to this day acknowledged. And the international distribution of the data came more from brave individual Chinese scientists than from an early government decision. So, a really mixed response. So finally, to the international bit, which system bit of this, I've already commented on the IMF. It's again being mixed. And I think we've seen some remarkable startups. There was last week, Chatham House had a a seminar with the director of the African CDC, which is having a much better crisis than the American CDC, for example, really pulling good data and response together. WHO, a mixed crisis, some inspired leadership around senior individuals, but not resourced properly with either the political backing or the financial means to offer the coherent leadership you might have anticipated. But again, I would just, in closing these opening observations, say that, it's not altogether new. I mean, WHO, at the time of HIV/AIDS was felt not to have responded adequately, so new organizations were created, UNAIDS, the Global Fund. In the case of Ebola, the main UN stepped in to lead the response. Case of swine flu, it was felt to have reacted too quickly, too soon, and to have been, having its strings pulled by Big Pharma wanting to create a market for its products, probably very unfairly. But, it's hard to get it right at WHO, but we don't resource it and give it the will to do as well as we'd anticipated. But as a consequence, a bunch of new international organizations, from Gavi, which was fundraising in London last week, to CEPI on the vaccine side, to the other organizations I've mentioned. So the idea of the international system not responding effectively isn't really new. And then I suppose the last point, which is to tee up for Elizabeth and Nick, the countries that have in the past been the friends of a strong UN response, particularly the US and Europeans. In the case of the US, almost entirely missing in action, and when it has raised its head, I'm afraid, more to harm the international response than to further it. And the Europeans, to this point, terribly preoccupied with their own internal issues of COVID response and economic coherence. But I expect as we go forward and we look at the longer term issues of rebuilding better and of a better green rebuild, you're actually likely to see a lot more European leadership. Whether the US comes back in with them or not, I expect depends heavily on what happens in November. Thanks, Leslie.
Thank you, Mark. I won't say it's inspiring, but it's certainly put very well. And I think one of my reactions, and probably many people, is, it might not be new, but my God, the stakes are new. The stakes seem much higher than perhaps they have been in the past, but perhaps that's just, where I sit. And I think it'll also be interesting to hear from you, either in the comments, all three of you in the comments, or in the course of the discussion, about some of these newer initiatives and transnational as opposed to international initiatives, and to what extent they can actually make the difference. But Ambassador Elizabeth Cousins, we look forward to hearing from you next.
Thanks, Leslie, and I'm definitely Elizabeth to you and to everybody else. So it's great to be here. It's wonderful to see you and to join Mark and Nick and everyone in this conversation. Let me just start with a comment about what's going on in the United States right now around police brutality and racism. Because I don't think we can have a conversation any longer about global leadership, and particularly about any US role in the world, without talking about the tensions, the connections, and the contradictions between America's stance in the world, or the role it sought to play, and racism and inequities at home. So just take COVID-19, which we're talking about today. Black Americans, as I think everybody on this call knows, are dying at over 2 times the rate of white Americans. Now that's for a lot of reasons we all know. It's for reasons we've all known about, and it's for reasons we've not remedied for generations. Now this is an historic moment in the United States, obviously. We are coming to grips and reckoning with our past, both our distant past and our very immediate past. We need to make historic changes that are just crushingly overdue. We need to confront and change behaviors, complicity, silence. We are in the midst of this as a country, as communities, and it's both an urgent and a very long-term task. But, from my perspective, no matter who is in the White House, no matter what their intention is to lead, no matter what issues on which they seek to lead, I just profoundly believe that we have crossed a line, and our potential to exercise constructive global leadership in the world is now inextricably tied to our seriousness about dismantling racism at home. That should long ago have been true, but it's just searingly true now, and I think it's important to say that at the outset. So let me then shift to say a few kind of broad observations about where we are on COVID-19. First, just a reminder to everyone about the unprecedented scale and depth of this crisis. And I know we all know it, but I think it's worth, it bears a bit of repeating. Over 7 million cases, over 400,000 dead, continuing increase in cases in many, many countries. You know, estimates from the IMF that the recession that's triggered by the response could cost the economy globally $9 trillion over the next 2 years, seeing for the first time in 30 years the risk of global poverty rising in significant ways, risks of famine and food insecurity, and we still have yet to see what we fear could be the worst specter of this disease in fragile and humanitarian contexts. So just stating that really, you know, plainly at the outset. And second, and you know, this very much flows from Mark's scorecard about the response to date. I think even as we're all clearly recognizing the necessity of just an unprecedented seriousness of global response, COVID-19 is also accentuating some pre-existing trends that are making that response harder. So I'll just name a few. One is the kind of inward look and trend in the United States that is intensifying in very specific ways. The US-China relationship, which was already confrontational, that's gotten worse. Some of the authoritarian trends that we're seeing in many, you know, erstwhile democracies are clearly getting worse. So, you know, the punchline being we need global leadership more than ever and at a comprehensive and coordinated scale, but the ingredients for that are in shorter supply than ever. But third, you know, I think there are some interesting countervailing dynamics, and I'll just mention a few, and these are what give me sort of grounds for, you know, not just hope, but actually some really interesting work that I think we can all do and think about together. You know, first, we're all very well aware of the decline in trust over many years in institutions, governments in particular, they're not only. But interestingly, trust in expertise has just shot back up as a result of this crisis. So if you look at the most recent work that's been published by Edelman that do all that you know, extensive and important work, people now are saying they want to hear from scientists, medical doctors, and experts. Those are the most trusted sources, and there's been a distinct change in the curve. You know, second, the business community. We are seeing incredible leadership from different quarters of the business community, everything from dealing with workplace and employee safety issues to supply chain bottlenecks to research and development to financing. And I'll just, you know, say that even in our own work at the foundation, one of the main things we've been working on in the last several weeks, couple of months, has been standing up what we call the COVID-19 Solidarity Response Fund to raise money for WHO and the public health needs. We've raised over $200 million in just 2 months from over 140 companies. And interestingly, that makes those companies, through our fund, the second largest single donor to WHO. So that's a really interesting phenomenon that we've seen. You know, new polls of government leadership. So there are other countries, clearly, middle powers in particular, but states and cities. And I'm glad to see we have Penny here from New York who could maybe speak about that. UN is obviously showing, I think, important leadership of the kind that Mark described, even though the track record is mixed. So just overall to say, you know, I think what we're at is just a profoundly important inflection point where the old leaders are just not showing up in the same way and sometimes in very unhelpful ways. But there are some new pools of leadership emerging. It's wildly unpredictable. It's very dynamic, but I do think we see the seeds of almost a new basis for multilateral action around some of these real mega global issues emerging. So I'll leave it at that for opening thoughts.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was, I thank you especially for your initial comments about what is happening inside of the United States, and obviously has had a tremendous effect in mobilizing people and bringing people onto the streets at a very, you know, dangerous moment. And then this is something that people are deeply concerned about, the passion and concern for racial inequality, for police brutality that's felt across the world, and especially in the United States, comes at an extraordinarily difficult time. But it's interesting to see the comments that you made about the progressive elements, the belief in expertise, some signs of hope and a turning point. But I'm curious what you think about this from your vantage point in the US at Harvard, in Massachusetts, and also clearly from your many years of leading in the US government. Ambassador Burns, can the US make a significant contribution in its current state, not only with the president, but also with the degree of division and inequality that we're seeing at home?
Well, Leslie, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody in Britain and around the world. Good morning to all of us in America. I'm really happy to be here. Leslie, thank you for chairing this. I'm happy to be with old friend Mark Malloch Brown. We fought a lot of battles together on the same side of the barricades at the United Nations at a time when a guy named John Bolton was the American ambassador. I happened to be in the same government, but not on the same side of most of those issues with John Bolton. And I've been a long time admirer of Elizabeth, and thank her for leading the United Nations Foundation, which we desperately need that organization to have an impact. And I think it's having an impact under Elizabeth's leadership. Leslie, I'll answer your question very briefly by saying we're not going to see the United States return to a true leadership role as long as Donald Trump is president. I'm an advisor to Joe Biden. A lot of people are, and I'm hoping for his victory because I think you'll see America come back if he's elected president in November. But if there's a second Trump term, it's going to redefine for a long, long time to come America. And I'm sorry to say this, America's role to the rest of the world. I wanted just to say a few things this morning, then we'll get on to a good discussion. What accounts for the lackluster global response to the coronavirus pandemic? I would say 4 things. First, the United States has been distracted and we've been self-absorbed. We have multiple crises underway. I can't remember a time really since I was a kid, 12 years old in 1968, when we were so divided. We have a pandemic crisis. 110,000 Americans dead. In that crisis, by the way, 14 of our states are showing increases in infection and mortality rates this week alone. So the hardest hit areas, New York, New Jersey, Michigan, my home state of Massachusetts, where I am now, we've peaked and we're on the downhill side of the curve, but other states are now ascending, unfortunately. We have an economic crisis. As you know, I think most people know, we have the highest unemployment since 1933. The height of the Great Depression, and no end in sight. In fact, a lot of economists are saying it may take us 9 to 10 years to fully come back. That's the individual, average American. I'm sure this is true of Europe as well, and many other parts of the world from the ravages of this crisis, of this economic crisis. We have a racial crisis. And Elizabeth spoke, and I agree with everything she said, very eloquently about the depth of that crisis. We're looking at the most massive protests in modern American history in terms of the numbers of people, the types of people, all ages going into the streets in almost universally peaceful protests throughout the country, despite what the president has said in mischaracterizing these protests. An unbelievable outpouring of anger on the part of African Americans, Latino Americans, and white Americans as to the way that African American young men in particular have been treated by police forces for a very long time across the country. I think Elizabeth is right. This has to lead to profound change. It's interesting. Every institution in which I am involved, from Harvard University to Boston College, where I'm a trustee, to the nonprofits that I'm on, all of us are now having introspective discussions. How can we collectively, individually help to heal? That was a point that Condoleezza Rice made in a very powerful Washington Post op-ed. It's not just what the president can do. He's not going to do anything to improve the situation. What can we all do individually? Because, Leslie, as you know, race runs right through American history from 1619, when the first slave ship arrived in Virginia, all the way through to 2020. So we have that crisis as well, the pandemic crisis, the economic crisis, the racial crisis, and we have a leadership crisis. We have the dramatic failure of the Trump presidency in responding to COVID-19, the failure of the federal government in the United States to lead. He left the states, President Trump, to their own devices, and there was a grotesque competition for resources, ventilators, PPP among the states, and sometimes between one of our states and even members of the European Union in a disorganized melee that should bring shame to all of us who believe in good government, whether it's national government or international government. And the failure of the president to be accountable. He said he was not responsible. Can you imagine if Franklin Roosevelt had acted this way during the Second World War, or Lincoln during the Civil War? You cannot imagine it. So if you put all those crises together, 4 big crises hitting America at the same time, it accounts for the failure of America at home and the failure of America to lead in the G7 or the G20 or in the United Nations. I think the second factor is that the United States and China have been competing throughout the crisis, and I frankly wouldn't have predicted this. Leslie and I were together on March 7th or 8th, I think, at a conference at Harvard. It was the last thing either of us did at that university before we shut it down and went on Zoom. I would have thought back on March 7th or 8th that the United States and China would have put aside their white-hot competition for power and would have combined forces at least to help get the data right so that epidemiologists could model the disease and do something to work together on a vaccine. And as you saw, it didn't happen. They've accused each other of the most outrageous things, both incorrectly. And for the number 1 and 2, or the co-powers in the world, to essentially not lead in any way, shape, or form is disgraceful. And it's no way to act in the last 3 months, 4 months, and no way to act in the future. I think third, Leslie, we can learn from some countries, and they happen all to be middle powers. Who did well? Which governments were ahead of the curve, took early action, tested widely, strong lockdowns, told the truth to their people? South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, New Zealand, Australia, Israel, Germany, Denmark, just to name a few. With the exception of Germany, these are middle-sized countries. Germany is the largest among them. And I think those of us who come from the superpower countries, China and the United States, maybe the European Union as a whole, Japan, certainly Brazil, India, we can learn from these countries. And part of what we need to do in government and out is to learn from failure. I think that the largest countries have failed. We can learn from these other countries. And fourth and finally, what could give us hope? How can we climb back? I think in the economic crisis, we do not see the US, China, the EU, Japan leading well together. But we do see, as presidents, prime ministers, we do see the central banks acting in a very collaborative way. I think Jay Powell of the Fed has been the best American leader on either the pandemic or the economic crisis. And I give credit to the Bank of England and the Canadian Central Bank and the Japanese Central Bank and Christine Lagarde, who I think has been a real leader for the European Central Bank. They get together every year in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. They're accustomed to working together. They're non-ideological. None of them are running for office anywhere. I think that's a model we can look at that might give us a little bit of hope. But certainly, and this is my concluding point, we need to all reflect on how we can do better the next time, because there'll be pandemics in our future. The economic crisis is going to stay with us for a long time to come. We know, especially we in America, we have to get back in the game on climate change. We have to re-enter Paris. We have to challenge the Paris Agreement to fulfill its quite modest commitments from 2015. And we're entering an era of transnational challenges where all of us are in the same boat together, 7.7 billion people in 195 nation states. So we better be thinking globally here in the US and around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very important, tremendous remarks. I especially appreciate the comments, I think, on middle powers. I guess I want to ask one question to all of you, maybe to you, Mark, since you spoke in the most distant past for this panel, before we open it up to our members of the audience. We're a long ways away from being through this pandemic and on to the next thing where we can pull together. I mean, we do have several moments ahead of us on which this question of coordination is going to have an especially great significance. And one of them is if there is a vaccination, which of course is a big if. What happens then, right? Who coordinates that? Who makes sure that this doesn't just become spiraling down to the lowest common denominator? There's a big question about borders. How do we keep borders open and not closed, not just physical borders and access for people and mobility? You started out your remarks talking about what's happening in the UK on that dimension. But that could spill over in any number of ways. But I guess when you think about, the specific moments of cooperation, where do you see in the next 6 months any kind of scope for concrete movement, and can it, in the absence of U.S. leadership, because clearly, from what you've all three indicated, we're not going to see that during the course of this current presidency. Is there anything, that you are struck by or might want to highlight, Mark, before we open it up?
Yeah, I think first, Leslie, as you implied, actually, 6 months is an interesting but not is much too finite a time frame, because I expect we've got this for some years to come. If you have a development background as I do, you're wary of some instant vaccine that's going to instantly inoculate or vaccinate the world. I mean, that isn't the history of vaccines, either on the medical science side of them or the sort of sociology of them in terms of distribution, acceptance and effectiveness. But the fact is, long before that vaccine has sort of reached the doctor's shelf, these issues about access to it have got to be settled, because there have to be priority groups. And ideally, you would want those to be sorted globally, that it was health workers or whatever, rather than which countries can afford to corner the market. And the omens are not good, because on earlier epidemics, when there was a much higher degree of international coordination, still countries were tempted to corner the market. So, trying to build the right programs and the right culture of solidarity and sharing when you've got such weak international leadership as we do at the moment is going to be tough to do. But I think in a way, you're right also to raise the economics, because I still think this is a crisis where the economics is going to be with us a lot longer than the health dimension. And I'm one of those who believe there will be, sadly, further waves on the health side. But on the economic side, this is the car crash that's tipped us into a depression-style event. And that is only really going to become clear to us at the end of the year and beyond, because third quarter, you may see some lift as people go back to work. But fundamentally, we've gone through the most destructive process of destroying both the supply and demand side of the global economy. And, I think the issue is not what the current leaders do, but how quickly, if they won't do things, will their electorates push them aside and find people who will, because it's impossible to imagine a rebuilding of our national economies unless there is a high degree of global coherence and coordination around doing it. So I think, this will, by the end of the year, have turned to the economics of rebuilding. And for all our sakes, we hope there'll be new leadership in the US, but that across Europe and elsewhere, leaders will either sort of jump into that project or indeed will face the wrath of electors at the ballot box. Because, I don't think incumbents who don't really grip this and show ambition and international sort of burden sharing will survive the crisis well.
Thank you. If you have a question, if you could put your name in the chat function, use the raise hand function. I'm going to ask one more question, perhaps to you, Elizabeth, especially in your current position, but to all three of you. And it's come to me in listening to Mark, and that is, in your conversations with your international counterparts, formally and informally, where is the balance between this concern for the economic effects and the concern for the health effects? It's clearly, a driving divide in U.S. domestic politics, with some people wanting to get back to work and others wanting to stay shut down because they see a direct trade-off. But in international organizations that you're most invested in, where is the balance? Are people saying the economy, open up, drive forward, learn to live with the pandemic and work around it? Or are they saying, watch out? Or is it really deeply contextual? Maybe Elizabeth, if you have something on that.
Yeah, a couple thoughts. I think first what I hear, whether it's from UN colleagues or it's colleagues in other countries and just people, really thoughtful people in the public health arena, is that it is an utterly false tension. And we have got to reject that is some kind of competition between economics and public health. There may be some trade-offs. Unfortunately, the way a lot of countries have been handling, not every country, but some countries handling this, it's made the trade-off catastrophically worse. Right? So that if we had much better testing, tracing mechanisms, et cetera, we would be able to reopen much more safely than we are presently in many contexts. So one is just, the better the response, the more you can shrink the tension, but we can't get into some kind of a dynamic where we see these as alternate goods that we have to make judgments around in short or medium term. So that's the first overall thing that I hear the most comprehensively. The second is just the stamina that we are going to need to show. There will undoubtedly be second waves of this. We may all get incredibly lucky, and the combination of R&D on therapeutics and vaccines means that we have some solutions quite early. But that, is not, you don't plan for the best. You always anticipate that you may have a much longer road, and I think we're all anticipating that that's likely to be the case, and we're going to have to manage these tensions over time in a very different way. And the third observation is just from every previous public health crisis remotely approaching this one, there has been a resounding recognition that public health alone is not the full dimension of a public health crisis. It has economic impacts, social impacts, security impacts, and that one of the gaps in the overall kind of architecture for preparedness and response is that we still don't really have reliable mechanisms, even in conditions that are more auspicious for leadership, to be able to handle those different moving parts of a crisis like this. So to me, that's one of the significant arenas of work and effort that we're going to have to look at going forward.
Nick, would you like to add to this, Ambassador Burns?
Leslie, I just say very quickly, I agree with what Mark and Elizabeth have said. Zheng Shao on the chat has asked, will the United States return to the WHO? I think it was a mistake for the United States to defund and then depart, to leave and to take our money with us. It's like defunding the fire department in the middle of the fire. It's really quite irresponsible. But I do think once the pandemic is over, once that day has passed, and as Elizabeth said, we don't know when that's going to be, even if there's a second wave, if there's a vaccine. I think all of us around the world, and Australia certainly has said this, Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, we have to ask some tough questions of the WHO. It did not perform well in December, in late December, and particularly in the first part of January. It seemed to be blind or indifferent to some of the problems the Chinese government had in Wuhan in January. I think we have to ask a lot of tough questions of the Chinese government. The Chinese government was not transparent with the rest of us. That hurt the Europeans. You saw the problems in Italy and Spain in particular in understanding the severity of the pandemic before it was on them. It certainly has hurt all of us. Brazil, India, some of the African countries have had a problem. So I think very important that China be asked to be more transparent or leveraged to be more transparent.
Okay, I have questions from Lou Lukens, Serge Raman, and then Anthony Dworkin. And if you can just introduce yourself briefly, that would be wonderful. Lou.
Hi, Lou Lukens, senior partner with Signum Global Advisors and a member of Chatham House. This is, I guess, really a question for Ambassador Burns. I worked on the 7th floor when President Obama came into office and traveled with Hillary Clinton on what we sort of jokingly called the apology tour. In anticipation of a Biden presidency, I think we'd see something similar, but it seems to me that the rebuilding of relationships and the restoring of trust to the United States is a much bigger mountain to climb this time around. And I'm just interested in your thoughts on what this looks like for the United States with the Biden presidency. How do we go about restoring trust and confidence in the United States?
Over to you, Ambassador Burns.
Lou, it's very nice to see you, and thanks for being with us today. Well, obviously, I'm advising Vice President Biden. I don't want to speak for him, but he's been very clear on these issues. He is all about alliances. He has said multiple times, including when he was last at the Munich Security Conference, just before he announced for the presidency back in February 2019, he said, America will be back. The America that believes in the European Union, the America that believes in NATO, the America that believes in the United Nations. He's been very clear about that. And I think that for Vice President Biden and for a lot of people in the United States in both political parties, it's been President Trump's disavowal of NATO, his maniacal campaign to try to discredit the person who I think is probably the most morally sound and effective leader in the world today, Chancellor Angela Merkel. It is disgraceful how he has treated her and how he has embraced his pal Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. He's done the same thing to try to disparage the Japanese as well as the South Koreans, accusing them of not being good allies to the United States. He's all about, I think the definition of a cynic. He knows the price of everything but the value of nothing. I think you'll see that's Trump. You'll see Vice President Biden return us to the center of these alliances, to understand that we have international obligations, that it's in the self-interest of America to be globally oriented. I do think it's going to be tough. A lot will depend on, if Vice President Biden wins, what the Senate and House will look like. If the Senate and House are divided between Republican and Democratic leadership, that's going to be difficult. I think particularly trade, and I know we've got people in here, including experts from Chatham House on trade. Trade's going to be a hotly debated issue in the US and in Europe and other places. Immigration is as well. So nobody believes we can go back and recreate some mythical past, say in 2013 or 14 or 15. We've got a plan for a renewed America for the next 10 years.
Serge, I'm going to let you ask your question. If you unmute yourself and introduce yourself. Serge Raman.
Hi, thank you very much, Leslie. My name is Serge Raman, and I'm a financial consultant with an interest in international affairs. So my question was based on the statement that it could take the US up to 10 years to recover economically from the coronavirus crisis. In the US as well as in Europe, we have seen massive financial accommodation to try and shore up the economies. So my question has to do with emerging markets and simply where is the capital going to come from? And do you think that there is going to be some form of global response, or should those countries look for bilateral agreements?
Mark,
Thank you.
I think that is your question, and you might want to give a little bit of background about your current work.
Well, Serge, thank you. Yes, I think about what Leslie means by current. I'm on an advisory committee to Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF, and generally have always been deeply interested in the issues of international finance and the developing world. And I think at the moment we're in that strange thing where there's been this sort of quick, immediate response by the IMF and others, admirably rapid by historic standards, but it's almost certainly completely insufficient to the longer term scale of this crisis. You saw massive capital withdrawal, particularly in March, from the developing world. You saw shutdown of all their export-oriented sectors, clothing in Bangladesh, coffee in Kenya, oil and gas around a bunch of countries as global demand came down. And, while some of that trade will pick up as the global economy picks up a bit, other bits are likely to be pressed long-term. Tourism, for example, oil demand, but also sectors like clothing. Are we going to go back to buying 5 or 6 cycles of fashion a year? I rather doubt it. So, fundamentally, there's going to be an economic reset in the South. And I don't think there's the option of going it alone. I think this is going to require and I think it's going to come to the fore in the political debates in the countries, the Western countries, the need to have a much more ambitious, coherent package of support to emerging market countries, because I think we're only beginning to see the economic damage they're suffering. And I think it will center on the IMF and the World Bank, but very much on the regional development banks as well, African Development Bank and its counterparts in Latin America and Asia. And above all, on the private sector, finding rules of engagement which allow it back in major public-private partnerships that deal with risk. And, ultimately, if that capital comes in longer term around a green rebuilding, as many are talking about, we could look back on this and talk about it having created some really important sort of turns in the road in terms of the kind of investment flows, public and private, that go into developing countries. But, that will require a lot of statesmanship by both governments, international institutions, and the private sector over the next 24 months, I'd say.
I don't know if anybody wanted to add to that. I've got many questions. Let me turn to, I have Anthony, Rutula Shaw, Sarah, Marianne, Anthony Dworkin, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Leslie, and thank you for really interesting comments from the panelists. So each of you pointed in some way to kind of points of light, encouraging groups that seem to be stepping up, whether it's these middle-sized powers or non-state groups, corporations, perhaps the EU in the future. And I guess my question is, can these groups together, do enough to make the international system work, to make the international institutions work, whether it's the UN, the G20, the G7, the WHO, perhaps reformed in some way, the World Trade Organization, etc. Can they kind of drive the system, and if so, how, as long as China and the United States, the two biggest powers, seem to be in a mood where they are resolutely opposed to any form of cooperative international response?
And I should say, Anthony Dworkin is a senior fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and a very thoughtful writer and contributor on many of these issues, well known to many of us. Ambassador Burns, would you like to try that first? Elizabeth? Ambassador Burns.
I'm happy to defer to Elizabeth and follow her.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I'll say very simply, I think we're in the middle of the biggest global live test of that question. Right, we're in the middle of figuring out in real time whether, in the absence of the kind of global leadership that you would have historically expected the United States in particular to play, and they are not playing it, whether that's possible. I don't know the answer. I think many of us are working on different dimensions of trying to make it so, but that is a real-time live test of what it looks like to mount an unprecedented requirement for global cooperation and coordination in the absence of that kind of pole of leadership. So I think it is the question. I think the other just dimension of it, maybe it's a little bit different, but just to say it, I think a lot of us are thinking a lot these days about smallpox. One of the historical achievements in the global public health arena and the international arena, that didn't happen at a time of great comedy between the United States and the Soviet Union. That happened at a time of significant tension. So this question about how to create space for coordination, cooperation around arenas of effort and common interest, even when the larger dynamics at play are not propitious, I think is an incredibly important one as well.
I would just add to what Elizabeth said, 2 points briefly. Anthony, I don't think the international system can work effectively without the US and China, at least on some of the issues, whether it's eradicating polio and malaria and responding to a pandemic and climate change. We've got to find a way for those two countries to work together. It happened in 2015 between Xi Jinping and Barack Obama. They came together to join the Europeans and Japanese and others on the climate change agreement. So it can happen with good leadership. The difficulty, and this is the second point, the difficulty I think that either party is going to have in governing in the United States is that we are in this period of intensive competition with China. And that's not a partisan issue in the United States. Most Democrats feel very competitive towards China on trade, on intellectual property violations, on our strategic military competition between China and the US allies and the US in the Indo-Pacific. And so I think the test for us as Americans and Chinese is we know we're going to compete in 3 or 4 big areas, but we have to decide that on certain big transnational issues where our self-interest and that of the world coincide, we've got to cooperate. I would hope that would be on the second wave or on a new pandemic. on climate change, on the global economic crisis. We have to come together. So how do you balance a competitive relationship with periods of collaboration? It takes sophistication, it takes strategy, it takes a flexible mindset. These are not the characteristics associated with Donald Trump. So again, I just think so much depends, at least here in the United States, on November 3rd and on Joe Biden defeating Donald Trump, which I believe he will do. But we learned in 2016, you can't count your chickens until they hatch. And so we're working hard, a lot of us, on that campaign.
Before I come to Ritula Shah, I just want to see if Mark wanted to add to that. And I should also say that, you know, in your discussion of the US and China, it obviously raises a very important question for the UK and for Europe as to not only what their own interests are when it comes to China, but given this tension and given this genuine and very deep need for cooperation, what role Europe should play. Should it seek to balance? Should it align with the US? Should it pick and choose depending on the policy? Can it come together? These are obviously really critical questions. But Mark, did you want to add something before we come to Ritula?
Sure. Well, let me pick up that European bit because, you know, I think many on this call will be absolutely in Nick's court on wanting to see a Biden win in November. But I suppose non-Americans amongst us would say caution against believing, you know, that American engagement internationally swings quite so far one extreme to the other. You know, there is always some element of continuity, and I think President Biden, with the best will in the world, will take some time to turn around some of those US issues which have run in this particular nativist direction in the last few years. So I think it is important that Europe steps up. And, you know, the great glory of Europe is not so much Europe the whole, but its constituent parts. It includes countries which for different reasons have had a deep commitment to the UN and to the international system. Britain and France, because they had the good fortune through the circumstance of the outcome of the Second World War to be founding members and therefore permanent members of the UN Security Council, which is increasingly, as their relative power has declined, has become a more important privilege and one they have to work harder and harder to kind of keep, if you like. And the second thing is that Europe has typically been home to a lot of countries, the Nordics, the Dutch, but also countries like Germany and Belgium, many others, who've profoundly believed in the idea of the collective good of working in a multilateral system because they can project their own values and powers more effectively. And so I think there is an absolute incumbent requirement on Europe to kind of start asserting itself more. It's got quite strong leadership now at both the European level. Ursula von der Leyen and Borrell, the High Representative, both are very kind of UN-otaire in terms of their values. And I think national leaders, particularly Macron and Merkel, you know, are very much about sort of making the UN work. So I think they sort of shouldn't wait till November. They should really sort of be using this period to push a lot of these issues into the formation of policy, which then a President Biden can come on board, adopt, lead, refashion. But they just shouldn't wait till November the 3rd, but they should get going now.
And of course, November the 3rd is only the election. There's a question of a transition, yeah, if that's what's to happen. And we're talking about, you know, well into January. I want to come to Ritula Shah now. Ritula, if you unmute your...
I am unmuted. Hello, Leslie. This is Ritula Shah, BBC journalist. This conversation has been set very much in the context of an absence of US leadership, of this competition with China. But I wonder if it's a little bit worse than that. Has this pandemic actually played into the hands of those who've argued against international cooperation, who've argued for deglobalization, and they would point to the need for your own production centers, say for vaccines, the need for shorter supply chains? Isn't it a little bit harder perhaps to come back from this position because some of those people who have argued these ideas have in a way had their positions bolstered? They've been able to blame someone else for their problems, for the problem of the pandemic. It's allowed them to strengthen their cause. I wonder what you think.
Who would like to try that? I certainly don't want to come after Rutula Shah trying to speak as eloquently. So I think maybe we'll come to Mark.
Okay, Richard, look, listen, I mean, it's a fantastically good question. It's one of the reasons why I cautioned, but didn't elaborate, it didn't spell out as to why, you know, I think the election of Biden doesn't change everything, is that I do think we are in a period of some deglobalization. And I think, you know, an awful lot of corporate boardrooms are preoccupying themselves with building what they see as more resilient, even if less efficient supply chains by either contracting and bringing closer to home their supply chains, or balancing by, if they still source from the Far East, making sure they source from Vietnam and India as well as from China, and you know, trying to bring not necessarily jobs home, but a lot of activity home, even if it's automated by the time it gets to the US and Europe. So I think, you know, we're going to have a global economy which is going to be very differently shaped and smaller after this crisis. But I think it is still a global system which, whether it is in areas of climate, health, and a lot of other issues, migration, remains fundamentally borderless, and therefore where global cooperation to find globally balanced and fair and equitable solutions is not going to disappear as a need. And final point, you're right, a lot of those nationalists who are in power now are making the argument that you've described. But perversely, I think this is a terrible crisis for incumbents. And, you know, if there are more nationalists in power today, by the end of the next election cycle, given the economic damage, falling cost of living, unemployment, that all our economies are going to suffer, I think just by the luck of the electoral wheel, you're going to have, as it happens, a lot more moderate, center-left, sort of opposition leaders, multilateral leaders in power around the world, because they're today's oppositions in many countries.
Leslie, could I just add to what Mark has said? I think Rutula Shah has asked a very profound question. And I think she's right in many ways, at least in what's implicit in her question, that trade is going to be, in my judgment, a highly contested issue for the European Union, for the Japanese, for the Americans especially. And even if President Trump is defeated, depending on the configuration of Congress, I just can't, it's hard for me to see how Congress is going to think about free trade agreements at a time of economic decline, massive job loss. And I think inevitably the correct assumption that our supply chains for certain critical and vital products are too far from North America. I think you will see, and this will not be a national decision, a government decision, you'll see corporations pull back, not in all, from all investment in places like China, but on certain technologies. I will say this, I think that Trump is an aberration in American history. He is an arch unilateralist. That is not the view of nearly every senior Republican in the Congress who believe in our alliances, who believe in engagement, many of whom believe in climate change. Something needs to be done. And it's not the view of the American public. In poll after poll, the American public is neither isolationist nor unilateralist, very sensible about America's engagement. So I think that at the end of the Trump presidency, his defeat in November will presage a return of American leadership in the main, not without problems in these contested areas like trade and immigration, but you'll see a very different America come back.
Elizabeth, would you like to add to Rutula's questions?
I agree with it. I think it was how, I mean, I very much share that observation and said a bit along those lines at the beginning, that I think this crisis has just intensified some of those trend lines that were already, you know, gripping many of our economies and societies. And paradoxically, it doesn't take away from the need for globally coordinated action of a variety of forms, but it does make it actually a harder challenge, at least in the short term.
You know, the tenor of this discussion is one of the first roundtables that we held when we moved to the virtual world, which now feels like, you know, we're very comfortable in this space, not least because we're all in the home furnishings that we've invested in for many years. But one of the first conversations we had was with people from the mayor's offices in Los Angeles and New York City. And it was a very different conversation, right? Because there was of course, frustration with the lack of coordination, but there was also a very rich story about transnational coordination between mayors and governors and other countries with each other, working across lines within the United States, across countries, with private sector actors. So this is a very different story that we're hearing today because in part because the focus has been very much more on the formal governmental structures. At some point, I would like you to say even more about, what the prospects or limitations are, because I know you've all worked obviously well beyond the formal structures that you've been employed in. But I want to come to Sarah and then to Marianne, and I will also read out a few questions from the chat line quite soon. But Sarah.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you to all the panelists. This has been incredibly informative and insightful. I wanted to first direct a question to Elizabeth, please, on your introductory remarks on sequencing and America needing to address some of the large, enormous domestic challenges that are taking place. You were encouraged to see the private sector participation in your campaign to fund the World Health Organization. Have you noticed similar impetus behind the private sector to participate in some of the activist organizations that are addressing racial inequality? I suppose that's my first question. And then completely switching gears, but sort of a two-finger on the conversation we've more recently been having. The headwinds on, again, on the US domestic support, the headwinds that the US faces domestically to try and get voters behind interconnected, multilateralist, internationalist viewpoints. When you look at the GDP growth forecast, both in the US, but certainly China not committing to a GDP growth forecast for the first time in quite some time. And of course, the emerging market economies having projected to have their steepest declines this year in 60 years. How do you anticipate compelling their domestic audiences to get behind these internationalist visions that we share? Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I'll start off and then welcome Nick's and comments in particular as well. I mean, first, just on what we're going through right now as a country. I think you are seeing every single institution, private or public sector, nonprofit sector, in different stages of coming to grips with their own role in a racist society, with their own issues that they have to work out within their own walls, with their own reconciling of what their role and job is in the world, whether they're a company or a foundation or an organization, and how that relates to everything that we are confronting, should have confronted so long ago, but are now having the opportunity to do in a wholly new way. I think you're seeing, a wide spectrum of ways that institutions and organizations are handling this moment, and it's an incredibly raw time. It's an incredibly, it's politically raw, it's psychologically raw, it's fraught, it's painful, it's important, it's urgent, it's all of those things at once. And so I think, we're obviously all in the middle of this moment right now, where we're seeing unprecedented numbers of people taking to the streets. And I have to say, seeing how many people are taking to the streets in other countries as well as our own is incredibly powerful. And again, kind of a connection to the theme of this of this conversation. In terms of just building American support for international leadership, for multilateral action, I think we're among many organizations that for many, many years have been doing polling of a variety of kinds. We continue to see quite sustained support for the U.S. exercising a thoughtful and responsible and responsive role in the world on critical issues that matter to people. The issues that are at the top of their agenda vary, but there has been surprisingly not very much of a dent in consistent high levels of support for responsible U.S. foreign policy that shows leadership in the world. That doesn't always go deep. Sometimes it's thin, but it is consistent, and it is at a fairly high level. And I think that's what we have to tap into in a new moment in time, where we're re-asking those questions around issues that clearly need a different level of global engagement from this country and overall.
Ambassador Burns, Nick, would you like to?
I find myself in very strong agreement with Elizabeth, not surprisingly, particularly on this issue of American opinion. If you look at the Chicago Council polls from 2019 and the Pew polls, they do show strong American, Republican, Democratic, Independent support for U.S. international leadership. But I think Sarah asks a very valid question. Does this present time of crisis make all that more difficult in talking to citizens and voters about whether it's in Europe or particularly in the United States, which has more of a history historically of isolationism? And I think it does make it exceptionally difficult if unemployment, Jay Powell thinks, the chairman of the Fed here in the United States, believes that unemployment by the end of this month could be at 20 to 25%. I hope that doesn't happen, but if it does, this is a true crisis, and a lot of voters are going to want political leaders of both parties to be focused here at home. I would just say it's going to take leadership. And I was reading just last night, ironically, about FDR. When he was hamstrung by an isolationist Congress in the autumn of 1940, when Britain was facing possible defeat during the Battle of Britain in November, December 1940, FDR did a simple thing. He went on American radio, and he said, when your neighbor's house is on fire, you lend your neighbor your garden hose. And there are two messages to the American people that I think that could resonate today. Number one, it's the charitable and good thing to do. Number two, it's the self-interested thing to do. Your neighbor's house is on fire. Of course you want to help your neighbor, but there's a self-interest in making sure the fire doesn't spread to your house. That leadership by FDR, I think, is a good template for the kind of discussion that, at least in America, here, our politicians need to have with voters and citizens. And I think we have a lot of people in both parties, by the way, Mitt Romney, for instance, in the Republican Party, Condoleezza Rice, Bob Gates, as well as people like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Amy Klobuchar in the Democratic Party. I think they can speak to the American people in those clear and open ways. I hope so.
Mark, would you like to add to this?
I say, no, why don't you get some more questions?
Okay,
just
I'll come to Marianne, please.
Yeah.
Marianne, if you introduce yourself.
Sure, I'm Marianne Petzinger. I'm a Senior Research Fellow in US Americas program at Chatham House. And I guess I wanted to focus a bit more on international institutions and global governance more broadly, and get your take on any kind of systemic weaknesses that the global pandemic has revealed. To what extent, is it a lack of political leadership, but to what extent could it also be a lack of international coordination, information sharing that wasn't adequately done, or also the rules not being fit for purpose? And then a second question that builds on that is then, to what extent do you see international institutions or particular areas that are covering perhaps really opening up a door to push forward reform? Or in contrast, are you more concerned that the immediate kind of just managing the crisis and the response to that in terms of the health dimensions and the economic dimensions risks really crowding out any larger scale efforts for reform that are needed?
Who would like to try that?
Shall I try that one?
Yes, please.
Now that I found my mute button. Look, I think going forward, I think there will be a move to reform parts of the international system. I think, as Nick has already said, and well, we've all said, the international public health system is going to be subject to a vigorous review after this, and a lessons learned to get much earlier, more robust sharing of critical medical data, a much robuster response, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think there are other issues, particularly around these new resilience security agenda, the sort of legacy of the crisis, if you like, particularly around climate and environmental issues, food security, some things which naturally link to the health crisis, where I think you're going to see strong reform, but it's not going to start with how can we make this particular international institution better. I think in that way, these international institutions have been very considerable part lost their hold on the public imagination. I can't see people rallying to let's rebuild the UN. What they will rally to, building on what Nick and Elizabeth said a few moments ago, is if they see the interest in a stronger globally managed food security system, they see the interest in a stronger globally managed burden shared response to climate change. So I think you're going to see an issue-based rebuild. And the second thing is, it's no longer going to be just around governments. I think that, as Elizabeth said, this has been a good crisis for experts and for scientists. It's been a good crisis for a new generation of international organizations like the one I mentioned, the Africa CDC. But it's been a pretty rotten crisis for many of the old 1945 generation institutions. If you read what the UN Secretary General has been saying through this crisis, most of it very admirable, but it's had almost no impact. The UN has been largely invisible in this crisis other than the WHO. So I think you will see a rebuilding, but around some new combinations of institutions and around incorporating non-governmental actors who've in general networked much better than the official government ones during this crisis.
Before I come to you, Elizabeth and Nick, I just want to read out the last two questions because we're coming right to the end of our session. We did have a question from Xiao about whether you see a new Cold War coming. We've talked about China and the US, but clearly there's still a concern. What is the future of US-China relations? And then we also have a question that I will say those colleagues that I deal with in the US, a lot of very serious scholars of US politics and foreign policy have also been discussing just in the last week, 8 days, I should say, about, how worried are you about the nature of the US transition? Trudy Hilton writes, I have heard fears expressed at the potential for Donald Trump to do considerable damage before leaving office if he is not reelected. Can anything be done to anticipate and manage that? But I know that you also want to speak to the broader question in your final remarks. So I will just give each of you, a minute, perhaps, to say something, either in response to those or to the final questions. Perhaps we'll start with you, Nick, and then Elizabeth, and then give Mark the final word.
Thanks so much, and thanks so much for inviting me to participate. I would just say two quick things. I think in the U.S. at least, but Elizabeth will have obviously a view on this too, it's going to be easier to make a case to the American people in a recession, in a time of pandemic, on the security side. NATO is very popular across the country and in both political parties. Support for our alliances with Japan, South Korea, Australia, our newfound security partnership with India, very strong in both political parties in Congress. So I think that as America comes back to re-engage with the world, I think you'll see it, maybe its more clear form will be in security. We're going to have a difficult time on trade. And I think that's where a lot of us, Chatham House, Harvard, the UN Foundation, need to put a lot of time into thinking, what is the right answer on global trade as we see a renationalization of trade, barriers to go up? And I think immigration will be contested, certainly in Europe. The right-wing nationalists and populists will be opposed, and we have our crowd here in the United States as well. Let me just say, I don't think we're in a new Cold War with China. We have to work with China, all of us, and yet we have to compete with it. That's the test. How do we compete and collaborate simultaneously? And finally, Leslie, I'm just going to end on hope. I think here in the United States, we've seen a heroic response by our doctors and nurses and first responders. We have seen superb governors in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. We've seen 4 former chairs of the Joint Chiefs of Staff stand up in the last 7 days to say they oppose using the military to put down peaceful protesters in Washington, D.C. and across the country. I think you're seeing people stand up to say we have to save our democracy and we have to return to reason. I'm sensing that America is in a much better place, certainly than you might think if you only follow Donald Trump's Twitter feed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Tempted to just stop there. So, just a few thoughts. I think when America comes back, it will come back different, and it will come back to a different world. So I think that's the first recognition that we will be in a new terrain on a lot of levels. I find there to be, tremendous potential power in a lot of what Mark was describing earlier, the potential for around some of these giant challenges that we face that are unimpeachably global in their dimension, that clearly need a different kind of level of engagement at a global level among different stakeholders, not just governments, to try to focus our minds around solving for those, building the politics around those, the kinds of institutional changes around those. I think there is power in that, and it is relevant to people because it's what they're worried about and what they want to see their political leaders and other leaders address and deal with. And just last, I do think we have seen, maybe this connects the 2 points, certainly in the United States, an extraordinary display of leadership at different levels. We work a lot on climate change. We work a lot with an organization called the U.S. Climate Alliance. That's 26 state governors, Republican and Democratic, who are still in the Paris Agreement. They're over 60% of the U.S. economy, even now, over 60% of the population, who are showing different kinds of leadership because it's relevant to their constituents. It's relevant to citizens and communities. So I think that's in the United States. You see analogous dynamics elsewhere. So we're kind of in a new political terrain on a lot of levels in a lot of places. And I think there's peril in that, but there's tremendous power in it. And that to me is where, I go for both energy and hope these days. So thank you.
Thank you. And I will let Mark have the last word, not least because Mark really helped so much to bring this terrific panel together, which I'm very grateful for, and grateful for all of you for joining us. Mark, would you like to help us bring this to
and on behalf of myself and Nick and Elizabeth, thank you, and thank Chatham House and all your team for putting this together. I think I'd like to finish on, this, not all novels finish well, and this one, I think, one's got to also say this may not finish well. If you look out at the global scene, we've already talked about the contraction and politicization of global supply chains and trade in a dramatic way, part of the geopolitical confrontation between the US and China. We've talked a little bit less, but touched on a consequence of particularly the economic dimension of this crisis, creating new inequality inside countries, as we're seeing with the tragic events in the US, but between countries as well, as the impact of the withdrawal of investment, the loss of jobs hits developing countries, I suspect, particularly hard. We've talked about how the private sector needs to be part of a solution, but before we get there, a lot of the debt crisis, which could consume many of the more middle-income developing countries, is private sector debt. And we face some relatively high risks of sovereign defaults later in the year. So this is going to be a very turbulent times where those who've asked during this session isn't there a risk we're going to become more nationalist, more sort of throw up the barriers more? Absolutely a right to ask the question. It's going to need huge powers of leadership and vision and imagination, not just by national political leaders, but civil society and business leaders, science leaders, mayors, governors, to overcome what could be, if you like, the sort of natural trajectory of events where the laws of physics take us, which is to a dangerous, more divided, angrier world. We've got to turn the path, and that is going to require huge reservoirs of leadership at all levels across all our countries.
I think that's a perfect way to end. It keeps us balanced. It keeps us exactly where we are, which is in a very difficult time. But thank you so much, Mark, Elizabeth, and Nick, and to everybody who's on the call. Thank you. And we will continue the conversation. It won't be easy, but we will return to it time and again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Mark, Elizabeth, thank you so much. Great to be with you.
No, Nick, pleasure all mine. Great to see you, and Elizabeth.